Today I'm speaking with Janine Harris. Janine, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, how
And
are you?
Janine you're out in California, right?
Yeah.
And you are a mother of three and an embodiment birth doula. I'm sure we'll hear more about that soon. And a yoga instructor, which is really cool. And I did want to let everyone know too that Janine Harris is a YouTuber, just like me. She has a YouTube channel called Janine the Alchemist. There's a link beneath our video. Please go like and subscribe and hit the bell and all that so you can see her great content. She talks about topics such as health, mindfulness, philosophy, and art history. And she has a particular focus on being trauma informed in order to create a culture that is more accessible for people who've experienced trauma. So that's what I know about you on a bio level, but what else can we know about you?
Something fun about this season of my life is that we actually recently moved to a farm. And so I'm learning about agriculture and I'm learning about, so you actually might hear donkeys and stuff behind me. So
Wow,
I'm kind of doing the homestead. That's what I'm
that's
learning
very
right now.
cool.
It's fun. Yeah.
What animals do you have?
We have cats, but I'm probably going to get some goats soon. I'm learning
Okay,
about plant life and the kids are helping me with everything right now. So it's fun.
that's very cool. Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, we're obviously here to hear your story, so I'm gonna pass the ball to you and ask you to just share from the earliest days, kind of where you're coming from with your journey with Christianity and spirituality, and I'll jump in from time to time with some questions, but we'd love to hear your story.
Well, okay. So I always grew up in the church. I grew up out here in Southern California. So I guess our church was non-denominational, but the name Baptist is in the name of the church, but they considered themselves non-denominational. And I went from elementary school all the way through to high school. And I always loved church. I really enjoyed it. I loved the community, the friends. I was in church choir. And eventually I was kind of in a lot of leadership roles. I really tried everything. I liked tech. So I did like the tech and lighting at one point. Um, and then eventually I was going on mission trips. And I know that I was also like a camp counselor for the high schoolers. One of the years that was something I really enjoyed the most. And I think that's actually what started all of this for me because working with teens and all of that stuff
Mm.
changed the way that I viewed things. But ultimately, overall, sorry about the air just went on. I um I really loved church and I really felt the spirit and I loved worship. I loved it all. I was very passionate. Yeah.
Mm. And just to clarify, were your parents both Christians?
Actually, no. My dad grew up Catholic on the East Coast and he believes in God, but he church isn't his thing, but he just was supportive of us and then we went. So my mom was more passionate, more strict. My On my mom's side of the family, it's way more legalistic, more more strict on that side of the family. But I was never forced to go to church.
Okay.
I couldn't wait to go, which I always say that when I talk about this because usually I hear that kids like kind of had to go, but I was like, yeah, when can we go?
I was the exact same way. I was homeschooled for a lot of my time, and one of the things that my mom had me do is she said, "I want you to pick one preacher on the Christian radio station." Then it's like a 30-minute segment, but if you take out the intro and outro, it's like 20 minutes of a preacher preaching. Like, I want you to listen to a preacher once every day, during the weekday for 5 days, and just pick one that you like and listen to it. But listen every day. And so you're talking a 30-minute commitment. I was doing 3 4 hours a day sometimes. It was just like same thing, like
Wow.
I want
Yeah.
the word.
Yeah, passionate about theology. That's the thing is I see now that I'm an adult, like I'm 30, so I see now that I was always interested in human behavior and I loved theology so much. I just wanted to learn everything possible about the meaning of life, and so I just ate it up. I wanted to hear everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And once you really truly believe it's ultimate reality and it's the only thing that really matters in life is you know understanding the gospel and the kingdom of God and the word of God and so forth, like that's your meat. It's like, why do I want to stay in the milk, so to speak? Like, I want the meat, I want the word, I want to chew on the good stuff. And yeah, and certainly being with God's people in church, it's the most important part of your week.
exactly. It was like, and also the community. It's worth mentioning, whereas I love my family and I feel that I'm very fortunate the way that I grew up. But when I was in junior high, my parents actually separated. And so that was, that's difficult for any kid. Um, but I saw the way the families were at church. And so I kind of, I don't know the word for it. I liked the way that it seemed like stability as well that played into it, and I love the faith based the way that they were so faith based and that they knew their values and that they would come together on this thing. And I was just that's like everything I wanted. I thought it was like the ultimate stability, and I also always felt held by God. That was something else I was going to actually bring up is that when my mom was actually pregnant with me, she they told her I was going to die. It's a very long story, but I didn't die. But when I was born, everyone, it was like a big miracle. And so my name, Janine, actually means um, a precious gift from God. So that I was just always told that, and I also have a godmother, and she was very spiritual. And it was just it's a whole thing. So I was just always very filled with purpose and passion, and I always felt held by God, and I always felt kind of safe in that. And so the issue of feeling whether or not like I wasn't a Christian, I wasn't always living in fear of losing my faith, like of losing my salvation, because I knew I was set. And so I just really wanted that stable family that and to just pursue it. And I felt like, God had my back, all that stuff. Yeah. I don't know how to
Hmm.
verbalize it fully.
You mentioned the word salvation. What was the first time that you really got presented with the gospel, and what was it like? Did you believe the first time you were told about it, or was it like it had to take a while to sink in that you really needed Christ as your savior?
That's really interesting. I don't know that I remember the first time because it was like it always existed. So maybe mm, I didn't give my testimony until like the 10th grade. I wasn't baptized in
Okay.
until the 10th grade. I was christened for extended family, but I wasn't at like baptized until then. So, but I was probably like 5 or 7 when I professed like my faith. I was probably like said the I do remember saying the prayer, but I
Hmm.
don't remember any details about like who it was, but I remember, yeah. And I said it and I totally believed it. And yeah, it felt
Hmm.
like my own personal choice.
Do you remember if you shared that with anybody, like with your parents or
Oh,
church friends?
yes. Yes, my parents. I was very excited about everything. I shared it with my parents. I remember this is a different time, but I remember we were on like a summer camp or something. It must have been, I must have been a preteen, where, they get you all hyped up. And then I went and I called my parents and I was like, we got to read our Bible together more. And I was just so on fire about it. Yeah. So I
Hmm.
definitely told my parents and my friends. I went to public school. I feel badly now about this and I've apologized since, but in high school, yeah, I was definitely evangelizing to all my friends.
Hmm.
Definitely telling them about the gospel and Christ. I just wanted them to come to church with me. Oh, I just
Hmm.
thought of a story. I don't know if I want to go, if am I
Yeah.
going too fast?
No, take us whatever. I'll probably go back with some questions later, but yeah, take us wherever whatever's coming to mind.
Okay, so I actually remember that I invited I had a lot of Jewish friends. There were a lot of Jewish friends on my street. Love them. I love their culture. Really, I had a really good time with them. But I had this friend where I just begged her to come to church with me because we were super close. And all of our other friends went to my church too. And so she's like, okay, I'll come and I'll hang out. And I was so excited. And the pastor, he scared her because he said something. I don't want to call him out like this, but he was well-meaning, but he said something. He was talking about Christ's crucifixion that day, and so he was like, "The Jews, they killed him," and it like scared her, and she never came back. She thought we hated the Jews because of the way that I understand it now, but I remember at the time that I was like, "You just don't understand." But it was very like I find that sometimes in the church we're kind of like in a bubble and you don't recognize that there may be people hearing it for the first time, like not a part of the culture. And so when she just got up there and he was like, the Jews, they killed him, it scared her and she never went back.
Hmm.
Couldn't forget that. I felt so terrible. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because I didn't think about this till much later. I would even say maybe even I didn't think about it in great detail until after my deconversion, but realizing that the Gospels are very anti-Semitic in certain parts, not all of them, but realizing how much blame they're putting on the Jews and how much, if there was a historical Jesus, that they, instead of putting all the blame on the Romans who actually killed him, putting it on the Jews so much. And it does bring a lot of questions to mind as to, why would they want to favor the Romans in the story as opposed to the Jews. But realizing too that in history, the anti-Semitism that arose out of Christianity that was just profound, especially, I was shocked. Have you looked into Martin Luther at all?
I
Like
did at one point,
with with
and yeah.
with the anti-Semitism?
Hmm.
I mean, that was mind-boggling that he was like, he went to Jews to share the gospel, thinking that they were going to be receptive and accept Jesus as their Messiah, as their Savior. And when they didn't, he was like, have nothing to do with these people, drive them out of town and don't interact with them socially and financially. Like he literally wanted them to basically shrivel up as a culture around him. And to learn in history that that mentality deeply affected, the leaders in Germany in World War II, that they were driven by some of his anti-Semitism, Martin Luther's. That was like mind-boggling, and it put so many pieces together. But I was thinking, wow, this is like from what you're saying, like the people that are, in that group, the Jews, they're going to look at this and think we're attacking them
Yeah.
because they rejected their Messiah, and it makes you think twice about what you're doing. You're like, yeah, I'm being very insensitive here, and you just don't realize it.
That's the thing too. I think there's a lot of well-meaning people, but it's there's a lot of things you discover where, you know, that probably was an intention, the anti-Semitism in there that a lot of people don't realize. It's kind of scary.
It is. It is. And then you realize too some of the other bad stuff with verses that are easily presented as being against gay people, and in other groups. It's like, wow, like I was part of a system that was in large part meant to attack anyone who didn't agree with us. And it really makes you think twice about where you are today. Am I still doing any of these things? But it makes you really regret being part of it and not picking up. Like there were red flags all over the place, and I didn't see any of them.
That's bringing up something for me. I, as a yoga teacher now, you know how they view how well, my church personally, they view that as I'm definitely demon possessed and all of that stuff. But when I began my my journey with yoga, I didn't realize this, and then one day I realized this is the thing that they've been trying to stop everyone from learning this entire time. And I hadn't realized how there's a lot of things that are said and done to stop you from learning about anything else. And that took me a very long time to understand, oh, exactly what I'm learning right now is what they didn't want me to learn. And I see why, because it does open up your perspective about the world quite a bit.
Do you remember what their concern was about yoga?
Their concern is that you're opening yourself up to demons.
Really? Okay.
Yeah,
Interesting. That's
yeah.
amazing to think about. But I mean,
Well, yeah.
I
Oh,
guess
sorry.
they relate it to Eastern mysticism, right? A little bit.
They do. So they see yoga as a religion. They see the poses that you're doing as you're worshiping different deities when you're doing the poses. And that when you meditate, that you shouldn't empty your mind because if you empty your mind, then the demons will possess you or you'll be susceptible to what Satan says to you. It's just, this makes my blood boil. I know why they believe it, but it's not true, obviously. Yoga is not a religion, and it's more of like it's like a lifestyle that helps you on whatever spiritual path you're on. So you could make it spiritual, you could make it scientific. It's more of like a physical, emotional, all physical, emotional, spiritual experience that you're your like ritual that you're doing for yourself based on whatever belief system that you personally have. But I love philosophy. So I did get deep into the philosophy. So there is mysticism. There's a lot of interesting beliefs in there. There are religions um, in the East affiliated with it, but I don't practice. I love to learn, and I love to learn all the mythology and all of the stories they teach. There's a lot to learn. Yeah.
Yeah, there is. And this is a quick side note, but I always think it's fascinating how they're so afraid of what I would generically call paganism, you know, in seeping into your worldview. And if they could see and admit that the paganism of the Osiris cult, the Attis cult, the Dionysius cult, all these other cults, Mithras, were so woven into early Christianity that it was just is like this is the same stuff. It's like
Yes.
you are inheriting paganism, and now you're suddenly gonna somehow make it the standard, and everything else is pagan and therefore bad. It's like your religion is itself pagan, like in thousands of ways. It's
Yes.
you don't see it, of course, but the irony is not lost.
That is it's a whole thing. There's a huge loss of culture for every race that Christianity is kind of encompassed, and they don't realize you take on different rituals from those beliefs, or obviously, sadly, things are destroyed. And as humans, we need those. We have those seasonal rituals and those seasonal celebrations, and they just kind of gulf it up and turn it into what they're going to do with it.
Yeah,
So
especially with the holidays, Christmas and Easter and all that.
yeah.
Crazy. Can I ask? I know we're covering a bunch of a large time frame here, but slipping back to when you were a young teenager,
Mhm.
what was it like when you were just you and God? Say you're um, everyone in the house is quiet. They're all kind of either watching TV or going to sleep soon, but you're just quietly, in your room on the floor in your bed. You got your open Bible. Like, what is that kind of what I would have called devotions that people called it different things, quiet time. What did you call it, and what was it like
Oh
for you
yeah.
to just sit there with your open Bible and talking to God?
I called it quiet time, and I loved it. I took very seriously the pray without ceasing. I constant prayer dialogue with God. I felt like my whole life was very like guided and synchronistic, and everything was a sign. And I loved opening my Bible and reading it. So I didn't do that every single night, but I also didn't feel because I wasn't so like afraid of losing my salvation. I was so strong about it that I wasn't like, if I miss reading my Bible today, that's okay. I felt very safe. Ultimately, it was it was studying. Sorry, I didn't mean to skip ahead to how I stopped. So pretty much it was studying the Bible that just to tell you, it was
Oh yeah,
studying
no,
it
it's
that made
you
me
can
not
you can
be
go
a
back and
Christian
forth.
anymore.
That's fine.
Yeah, but yeah, so scratch it. But yeah, I didn't read it every night, but I definitely would take a time maybe before I went to church or before Bible study. I would try to do the try to read everything before we met the next week. And I would really kind of fixate on the meaning behind verses I didn't understand, and I would ask questions whenever I could.
Like asking questions of your parents or people at church, or just asking God directly.
I would ask God directly, or I would always ask pastors, Bible study leaders, and sometimes my mom. I would usually go to the pastors and things first, and then if it was super tricky, then I would ask my mom what she thought.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Did you feel like you were ever hearing God, either in the sense of literally hearing Him, or just in the sense of like you felt a presence, entering the room, or just some kind of
Mm.
sense of Him guiding you, or if it was maybe, should I, say you had an elective choice to make at school where it's like I'm going to take French or Spanish, which one should, God tell me which one, and God opens up a door and says definitely take this one. Did you ever have those kind of senses of God leading you and speaking to you?
I never heard him audibly, although I really, really wanted to. I even I think I even asked. I wanted to hear it. I felt that if anybody would, it would be me for some reason. that might have been ego, but anyway, I thought maybe it would be a thing. But I guess I felt that he was always guiding me. So I would see something would happen and I would be like, oh, that was God, or um maybe something would happen in the way I didn't expect, or if I let's say I didn't get the thing I prayed for, but then there was a positive that came out of that experience anyway, I'd be like, okay, that was God. That was his confirmation that it was meant to be this way and not that way.
Yeah. I was curious, since we're talking about this topic, how did you deal with the issue of when God would shut doors? What I mean is this: let's say that you were praying for some answer to a problem, and go this way, go that way, go left, to go right, and you get convicted that God really wants to go this way with it. And then for some reason, like the circumstances of life make it kind of fall apart, and you're like, I can't go that way. And there was such a conundrum in my mind that I always had. And I'm curious if you had this too, and if how you dealt with it. But you could take it a couple ways. You could say, number one, God, he didn't ever really want you to go down that path, but you just felt like it was a good path. But he's clearly, if you didn't hear his voice the first time when he said no, he's making it clear it's a no.
Yeah.
It could be, secondarily, that he's actually saying, no, that's still the path I want you to take. I'm testing your faith. Are you willing to push harder and open that door? Because I don't want you to go the other way. I gave you the conviction to move that way, and I still mean it. Move that way, even if it's harder than ever. And of course, a third, probably more options, but a third easy option would be, that's the devil trying to get you to be tempted. And he wants you to go that way because he knows God wants you to go the first way that you felt convicted of. Did you feel that tension? And if so, how did you deal with it as a Christian?
Oh my gosh. I think, maybe not consciously, but I think that I thought that disappointment was very hard, but I thought perhaps for some reason, disappointment was a part of my journey. And like that's what he must want. That sounds kind of depressing and dark, but I thought maybe like I'm just not meant to like have the things that I want. And so I wasn't quite clear on what God wanted for me, but I was open to whatever doors would open, I would go that direction.
Hmm. Almost
And
like he
I,
was disciplining you, potentially, like not disciplining
yeah,
you like in a negative sense, but just like shaping your heart to be more focused on him than on what you wanted.
yeah, like trial by fire,
Yeah.
like eventually I'm going to be, and that I think in a way, yeah, we do grow from disappointment and from trials in life, but I did feel sometimes like this is very confusing, especially when I was open. I felt that my relationship with God was very honest. I spoke honestly. I was honest about my questions, which I realized eventually got a negative reaction when you ask questions that are, if I wasn't acting fake, I felt like I kept getting negative feedback. But I thought, well, you have to be yourself and you have to be honest about your journey. So I'm just going to keep doing that, even if it's not necessarily serving my like the way that I want to be perceived or the way that I want people to treat me. Like if even if it's embarrassing or even if it's okay to ask questions, I just super open. It's just that the problem with it, I think, looking back at it now, is you're not, I think intention is very important, right? And if you could be easily led in directions that maybe you wouldn't go in. And who is really in control of what you're doing? Is it really what God wanted, or was it just that this pastor needed more people to do this mission? And so now you feel like you have to do that mission, and then I was just kind of being guided by what you're being told to do by the church. Yeah.
Hmm. It it definitely leads you to just feel very unsure about how to see it all. And I think what it does in some ways is actually stealthily tricking people, in the sense that you get drawn into this sense of God does have a message for you. You're just not as receptive as you need to be. God does
Yeah.
have a path for you, but you're not, if you had all your spiritual spidey senses where they should be, you'd already kind of know what he wants for you. But um, he's guiding you, he's teaching you, he's maturing you. And 5 years from now, this path would have been clear, but right now you're immature enough that this path is not clear. And he just wants you to embrace the mystery of saying, God, like my hands are wide open. Give and take away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Put things in, take things out. I will just keep on seeking your face no matter what you do. And you get to a point where you really feel spiritual by feeling like God's will is vague because you're specifically saying, God, I totally will let you steer my life. Let it be
Yeah.
vague to me. I know it's clear to you, but I know you're the master artist. You're the master mathematician. You're brilliant and you're amazing. You're smart beyond our understanding. And therefore, do with my life as you want to. I know you'll make it something beautiful. I don't need to know. I don't need to understand. And you almost get this confusion almost leads you to be quasi spirit, more spiritual. You know what I mean?
Yes, yes. Yeah, I would do that where you open the Bible, close your eyes, and then like point to a verse. I still do stuff like that because I do think if you don't know what it can be a helpful tool to do things randomly and to just kind of see where the chips lay. But yeah, yeah. And there is something positive about being open to going with the flow, but I do think there are problems that surface when you're not um, in control of any of it.
Yeah, very much so. And thinking that someone else is when they're not. You mentioned church choir, volunteering, just being active in church and mission trips. Can you tell me more about like just what church life was like for you and volunteering, what all that meant to you on a daily basis and just how it affected you, especially in terms of you mentioned sharing the gospel with your friends. What were you doing with all those ministries?
So I'm just a very community-based person. I'm an extrovert. So I loved being put where I could help the community. So I remember I volunteered in the children's section sometimes in the evenings. I loved choir, I loved to sing, and that was a really great time for fellowship, as we would call it. I had a lot of positive experiences at church. I don't really have anything negative to say um, about choir, except my church was not Pentecostal. It wasn't the kind where dancing was normal. But my family's very musical. So I remembered feeling like it was controversial. Nobody said anything to me negatively about it, but I felt uncomfortable that like I wanted to dance and move and go to the beat, that it felt strange to me in that space that it was that's weird when you are singing and you're feeling it. I remember I I would really in the worship services, not singing on the stage, but being in the worship services and worshiping God, that I would feel that thing everybody feels that comes over you, and I would feel really taken away by it. And then I would be like, whatever. And then I would kind of move back and forth and try to not care. But I did think it was strange that it was so looked down upon at our church to focus on dancing I just felt like it was weird that it was a weird thing at all. But I definitely
Mm.
felt the spirit. And yeah, those were my favorite moments. But I'm
Should I
trying to
say it's
think.
true about the dancing thing? I remember reading that verse about David dancing before the
Yes,
Lord. And I was like, if he's doing it, why aren't we? It just makes no sense.
it makes no sense.
Hmm.
I
And
yeah,
especially when you get like into teenage years in the youth group, they're talking so much about be on fire for the Lord and I want to shine my light. I don't want to be a casual Christian. And you're like, I I mean that literally, not just with my life in the big picture. Like I don't want to be casual about the Lord right now. So think about
hmm
him and what is your body saying? Dance for the Lord. And I would have been embarrassed myself, I'm sure, if I tried to dance for the Lord. But you just felt like you should because you're like, we've been saved from the worst fate possible. We should be the
yeah,
most joyous people. It should be hard for us to not dance all the time if we're truly saved.
yeah, like make a joyful noise. Like, yeah, I get what you're saying.
Hmm.
Uh,
Can I ask, we've talked a little bit about salvation. Could you define for me the gospel? What is sin? What is what is the outcome of sin? And what is Jesus and his the story of the death and resurrection have to do with it? Like, how does someone get saved and have peace with God?
Okay, well, sin is missing the mark. Sin is, in the Garden of Eden, God told them not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and then they did eat from it. So uh, they were told to leave, or they were made to leave the garden, and they had to toil and work the ground. And now women have horrible bearing pains, and essentially, we need a savior because of that original sin, because the first people didn't do what God said. Now now we need saving in order to be with God in heaven in the afterlife. So Jesus came down and he died for us, and because of his sacrifice, and if you accept that and you believe that he sacrificed for you, then you can enter the kingdom of heaven. Does that sound
Gotcha.
good? Is that
Yeah, that's very similar to what I would have said. Yeah. So
yeah,
you would say that he was dying in your place.
dying essentially, yes, dying and suffering also
Hmm.
what you should have suffered.
What was your understanding of the fate of those who did not believe that or did not accept it as the free gift from God?
That they would burn forever in hell
Hmm.
and like experience eternal torture.
Did that become a motivation for you to try to be more proactive in sharing the gospel? Just the fear of
Yeah,
loved ones facing that?
absolutely.
Hmm.
Yes.
You mentioned your missions trip. Was it to Prague?
Yeah, so we went to the Czech Republic. It was a more tame missions trip. It was teaching them how to speak English. So some of them already did know English, varying degrees. And we weren't building anything. It was a fun summer camp that we put together, kind of like a Jesus camp. It was with games, and it was fun,
Hmm.
just conversing back and forth. And
Was there any sense of sharing the gospel with them, or was it more just like laying the groundwork for a future visit to do that?
it was to give the gospel. And I think that a lot of their parents were affiliated with church. So I do remember though that I don't know if it's true of the whole culture. There's a lot of atheists there, but I remember that a lot of the students were atheists, and our group was having debates, but they weren't super heavy and heated that I saw. Maybe there were, but it was enjoyable. There was a lot of debate.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And going back to your story a little bit, did you feel like most of your childhood and young adulthood was, how should I put it, fairly easy, in terms of your overall life experience with the Lord, or was there any, you know, points in your story in your timeline where it was a little bit more difficult, or any trauma that occurred?
Oh yeah. Okay. So I'd like to give a trigger warning just in case it might be a little bit heavy for this part of the story, but I do think I've had a very fortunate life. But yeah, I was sexually assaulted in high school, and those things are complicated. My story, I won't be giving in grave detail, but there's a lot of things that were confusing to me about what happened. And I went to the church, and I felt that the support was sort of lacking. So there was a boy that I met in my youth group. So actually, let me mention Czech because so when we were in the Czech Republic, because we were having all these debates and there was essentially no movement. No one was coming to Christ. It was mainly debates. And my group knew my testimony, and I was comfortable with public speaking. And so they asked me to give my testimony to the kids before we closed up camp. And it was actually so there was actually a kid who came to Christ after my testimony, and it was because of that that I rethought. I realized I really had to rethink everything. I don't know, I didn't know what it was at the time, but so I talked about the sexual assault situation that happened to me when I was 16. I must have been 20 at the time of giving the testimony, but I hadn't processed through the trauma properly. It was very confusing. And I remember that when I went to my pastor and asked for guidance on it, I went to all the care departments. They were lovely ladies. They would essentially just like point to the Bible and just tell you to read those verses and just keep praying. And I did feel that that helped me feel more positive and hopeful, but it didn't stop like the PTSD flashbacks. And I thought it was just pretty much like a life sentence that forever I would just have terrible flashbacks and then I would just have to kind of live with it. And maybe someday it would get better. But I remember that there was also a point before I was giving that testimony where there was a year or so after I graduated high school where I kind of partied. I didn't party too hard. I drank, I partied with my friends, I had more fun. I was more just and that was like a way of escapism. And I that was when I thought I need better help for this. And there was a point when I went to the pastor of the church, and it was a pretty big church. It's still a church, he's still the pastor. Um, and he was, I'm gonna name drop. So, okay. He was somebody who was a professor or is still a professor, I'm not sure, at the master's college. And I remember that when he was brought in, because he's a newer pastor, we had someone else before that. When he was brought in, it was this huge deal that this is going to be the most theologically sound, most amazing, like getting to business. None of this fluffy stuff. We're going to, talk about things that with real conviction. And everybody was super excited about that. So he came really highly recommended, and everybody's like, this is such solid theology. And I was super excited about it. So I make a meeting with him and I go in with the intention to talk to him about this and ask for his advice. I don't know if he knew that, but that was why I went to see him. And he listened to the story. And sorry, I'm feeling my heart's racing because I remember it was very intimidating and I didn't feel comforted. I felt very intimidated by him actually, which made it harder to talk about what happened. And then his response right when I finished telling my story was, you just need to forgive him. And that's what he said. And so it's not that that isn't a part of the healing journey, but I just feel very strongly that that's not the first thing that you say. It's
Mm.
not the first thing that you say. And I do believe that at this point I have forgiven it. I have moved past to an extent that I think is pretty good. And I do think it will get better. But it didn't come from just telling me to read the Bible and just forgive him and just pray. So that was the advice I had. And I was kind of devastated by that advice because it didn't really help. And then years go by, I tell my testimony to these kids. And the point of the whole thing was basically that what kept me going was my faith in Christ, that God is holding me and that there's a plan for my life. And that's what kept me going and kept me, I didn't use the word inspired, but that was truly what was happening. I stayed inspired and hopeful because of that. And I guess that was just so compelling that one of the kids came to Christ, and I was supposed to feel good about that, but I actually felt uncomfortable by that, which is it was interesting thinking about that later on.
Were you uncomfortable because you were afraid they would go through some kind of similar experience talking to a spiritual leader or
I
something else?
felt, yes, I felt that the whole reason I wanted to give my testimony was because when I had been a camp counselor, maybe a year or two prior, I was given a cabin of girls who were kind of, they're teenage girls going through different things. I got like the heavy group for some. I thought give Janine the heavy group. She likes the heavy stuff. I don't know why I got the heavy group of girls with a lot of different things going on. Some of them having that issue as well with SA or like domestic violence or just being like, I want to have sex with my boyfriend, but I don't know, that kind of stuff. And I felt that the church wasn't meeting the needs of the teens. And I think must have been like 19. And so I was still a child, in my opinion, but I was thinking like, there's something lacking here. There's something in the sex ed, there's something not helping the teens. So that was why I wanted to give my story, was I felt that it wasn't being done properly. And I thought that if I helped, that it would be better for the teens. And I think it, when I think it was helpful, but I didn't know that, we were going to go home. Like, I don't know if that kid got whatever help he needed or whatever was going on in his life.
Hmm. It's interesting the story you mentioned too about the need to just forgive for an assault, and for that message is given to a lot of context, but I think that it arises in part from this theology that basically says, look, we're all horrible murderers in God's sight. We effectively put Christ on the cross, we effectively hammer the nails in. And if you've ever had one single thought that was in any way inappropriate, or um, you've ever lied or been tempted to lie, you've ever wanted to not tell the full truth, you've ever wanted to steal, you've ever done anything at all that offends God, that you're basically at that point, you've broken the chain. They used to paint the picture for us as like your righteousness is like a chain, and all it takes is one link to be broken and the whole thing falls apart. And it doesn't, you don't need to have 100 different links that are broken. One of them breaks and the whole thing snaps. And so they would point it out to us as kids that your sin, all of it's bad, and all of it in God's sight is equally bad. And so you end up with a spot where someone that would commit a sexual assault or something like that, and you compare them to someone who's told a little white lie, or a kid who's stolen candy. They saw a chocolate bar and they put it in their pocket at the grocery store when their parents weren't looking, and snuck out with it. And you get this picture painted like God sees you as equal. You both deserve hell. And I can't I can't describe at this point how many people I've seen where that theology has messed them up terribly because of the messaging you're saying, where you get this, the other side of it is, okay, well, if someone has offended you, you need to forgive them, like, because you're just as much as an offense to God as they are. And what are you going to do? Like, hold something against them? You're a murderer. You've lied against God. You've nailed his son to the cross. Like, who are you to hold up your righteousness and say, oh, they offended me, they hurt me? You're the one that's the offender. You're the one that's hurt so many people. You're the one that's offended God himself. So why are you claiming this victim status? And they paint this for people, and people, I think, truly buy into it and get this perception that I can't speak up for myself, I'm just as bad as they are. And then you add in often, look, if you make a big deal of this, you're going to break up the unity of the church. People are going to take sides, and oh,
Oh my
maybe
gosh, yeah.
this, that. It's like, and so they say, for the unity of the church, and because you need to have a forgiving heart anyway, and God has forgiven you so much, who are you to not forgive back? Just forgive and move on. Let the unity of the church prevail. And people feel very much like they need to just sit down and shut up over this stuff. And it's horrible. It's a horrible message, especially when it comes from not just your peers, but from the top level of spiritual leadership saying you must do this.
Yeah.
Mm.
It felt like he really lacked empathy. Like, after that interaction, I felt I really didn't like him. I really didn't. And I felt like this is the shepherd to the whole church.
Mm.
And to his credit, he said that he wasn't too good with the more emotional things, that he was more like book knowledge, that he knew his theology, and that you should go to somebody in the care departments. But I felt that since supposedly the community is for support, we're supposed to come alongside each other when it comes to emotional and all that stuff. I felt like there's something wrong with having the pastor be a non-empathetic person.
Mm. That's a great point. Yeah. And if your theology doesn't warm your heart, like, what's the point at that point? Being able to catalog and chloroform and dissect everything and diagram it all. It's like, if you don't have a warm heart, what's the point? Yeah, that's crazy. And I know that some pastors even say empathy is a sin, which is
Oh my
crazy.
God.
But I will just say, I know we're going to move on to the next point here shortly, but um, number one, we're sorry for what you've gone through. That's horrible to have gone through that, and I'm sure the pain, like you said, it lingers, and it's going to get better over time. But we're sorry that you had to face that situation, and we're very appreciative of the fact that you have a voice to speak up for other victims and to help them, process things better, and, be able to hopefully have a voice themselves based on seeing you as an example.
That's very kind.
Yeah.
Um, I find comfort just that this is not very comforting, but so many women go through this. And so I think it's just a matter of like how we're going to deal with it now as a society.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think that there are some voices that are trying to tell people like your autonomy matters, and that's really good. I'm very glad of that. There's the voices are definitely rising.
Mhm.
No means no. Marital rape even is a thing, and
Yes.
you do have the autonomy of your body, and we need to respect each other a lot more as a society. Can I ask? We're I know we're talking about what we've just been talking about, but it does relate to one other topic that I did want to ask you about. So I want to bring it in a little bit. How does gender roles, how did that play into your upbringing at church? What did they say about your role as a woman? And did that play any role in this whole dynamic of the story you just shared?
Absolutely, it did. So, I don't want to, it's all the basic things that you would imagine, just being brought up, being told, this is what a girl does, and this is what a boy does, and this is a woman's role in a marriage, and this is a man's. But for like those things, I was like, cool. Ultimately, for me, when I was a believer, it had more to do with if there were things I didn't like, I thought it's the God of the universe. And so if there are things I don't like, it's kind of that doesn't matter because, I'm not God. And if that's how God designed it, I don't really have a say. So it was more like the things that would affect me on a personal level with people that were getting me. So a good example after all that had happened to me, and I have lots of friends where they had other types of situations. I remember there came a time when we were all, everyone's trying to abstain from anything having to do with puberty. Everyone's trying to abstain, right? And so we're all talking about what kind of partner you want. And I remember I was having this conversation with a guy who was like a friend of mine, and I really respected him, enjoyed his company. It wasn't like a crush or anything. We were just having a casual conversation. And he was like, well, I would definitely like the most important thing is that she's a virgin. And it was at that moment where I thought, like, because it was like a knife right here. Because sometimes we don't, even if I would prefer to not have an emotional reaction, your body has an emotional reaction. So even though what he was saying wasn't personal or having to do with me, and we would never be partners, just hearing someone say that, it hurt because, well, what about people who have had situations happen and they were a virgin? You know, the
Hmm.
most important thing is that she's a virgin. It makes me want to cry right now thinking about it, you know? So I don't know
Yeah.
if that has to do with gender roles, but I felt that that does for some reason for guys that being number one most important thing is that she's pure and virginal.
Hmm. I know that for a lot of guys, it's just what they're handed as like that's the most important thing, and they kind of are parroting what they're told. But I think for a lot of guys who went down the theology path, it's also about the idea of does she want to truly represent Christ and the church in their relationship, where you would say, um, not necessarily that, I don't think I would have necessarily said that I would have needed to marry a virgin, but just that a girl who was, once she got serious about the Lord, from that point on, she was, remaining faithful to be chaste until she got married. But the idea of like the church is being driven to be chaste to Christ, as opposed to if you could say, well, the world and the devil or the other lovers you could pursue, don't pursue them, pursue your one true husband, Christ. And so it was a sense of like, once you're betrothed to him, honor that betrothal and be faithful to him. And therefore don't love the world, don't love the devil, don't love yourself, love Christ. But it does picturesquely carry over to the virginity issue. And yeah, it's very insensitive to people that have been the victims of some kind of attack, but also some people just make mistakes. Like they just, and I don't want to
Yeah.
frame it as a mistake as if a sin, but just some people are young, and some people voluntarily have relationships where they give away their virginity, and maybe they weren't old enough to think through whether or not it was the right time or the best decision. Maybe they were, and maybe they were quite happy with their decision, but in the church context, they end up being ostracized for it. And I've shared this story before, but I remember as a young kid hearing a girl who was 16-year-old pregnant girl get up in front of church in the evening and apologize to the whole church, 100 people, whatever. Say, I'm really sorry. Obviously I'm pregnant and I'm going to keep the baby, but I made a horrible mistake. The boy wasn't there. I don't know why not, but she felt the need to apologize for this and to say, from this point on, I'm going to remain faithful until I'm married and so forth, or remain chaste until I'm married and no longer be sexually active. But, and of course, the implied bigger picture, I'm going to, of course, raise my child to love the Lord too. But she was pushed and felt the need to apologize for being sexually active. And it really sends a strong message of, I know this isn't gender roles. I'll go back to that in a second, but it's a really strong message of like, you fall out of line here and you're dirty. You're really dirty
Mhm.
and you're worthless. Like you're saying with that guy. Did you did you feel like when you reflected on that kind of messaging that you were worthless in some ways, either to other boys or to God?
I think that I was treated, yeah, it's like I don't want to say that because I like to be like positive of your self-concept or whatever you have about yourself. But yeah, I think that when I was in college group, it became obvious to me that the boys, or yeah, the boys, I was going to call them men, but we were all very young. They all, I felt that they didn't treat it, I didn't notice the poor treatment until I was college age of the difference. So I remember there were these guys that were talking about theology in this huddle. And I wanted to know, I wasn't interested in talking about small talk. Like I wanted to know everything. And I had so many questions. So I would like hop in and they'd be so irritated because, and then they just told me like, this is not for women. And I was actually shocked because I was like, I'm pretty sure that isn't biblical, or I said something like that. But I remembered feeling like they would look at women as, you're nothing but a stumbling block for me. And like a sexual stumbling block for me in that,
Mm.
in the group and in the church I had. I was very, like I said, I was just very outgoing. So I didn't see myself as stumbling the boys by existing. But I guess that was what it was. And so I wasn't allowed to talk to them, or they just looked at me with like disgust if I tried to like talk to them, because they basically did say that to me, that it's like, yeah, as everyone's saving themselves for their wife, they don't even want to like look at or talk to me, and I can't be a part of the conversations because I will cause
Mm.
them to have a problem or something. So that was frustrating. There was something else you said that
Well,
I forgot.
that's crazy, but it's like you're saying you're a seductress just by existing. It's just
Yeah.
crazy. It doesn't
And I
make
felt that way. I felt that what had happened to me made me more like that or something. Or if people knew about that, like if you've done it or something, like something's happened to you or
mm.
something. Yeah.
It's very weird too how, you know, the concept is basically in a phrase, it's a lady in public and a whore in bed. And like they want that. They want you to be chaste. They want you to look like you're perfectly not a stumbling block. But then of course you get married, they want, to be very, very sexually active and have a woman be completely free sexually. And that dynamic, it just, you can't send messages that are so divergent to people and expect it to work out. Okay. I mean, basically and it goes both from men to women, but women to men too, and a lot of men to men, where we're kind of set up with this sense of what would you call it? Dual personalities, almost like a Jekyll and Hyde, where you're kind of like you're supposed to want sex, but you shouldn't. And
Yes.
if you want to, I was gonna say, speak to that if it resonates with you.
Okay, I will speak to this. Okay, I do actually have a little side point. So I am a doula, right? And so I've learned a lot about female anatomy and human sexuality and the whole cycle of, because the whole process of birth is sexuality, right? So a lot of women from the church, I've discovered, not everyone, I'm not one of these women, but they experience something called vaginismus. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's when you can't climax, or sex is very painful and unbearable. And it's a lot of people believe it comes from this kind of culture, from this withholding and for so long and feeling like it's wrong. And then when you're married and it's like, okay, have at it, then it's like, why can't I all of a sudden? It happens a lot. I was actually shocked. It happens a lot
Hmm.
where they've like
It's
never
so sad.
experienced climax
Hmm.
because of like their whole life. And then they're like, but I want to be sexually free and open. They can't, you know?
Hmm. It's such a mind job and a body job, the way it affects people so horribly. One thing too that I think is really sad from a man's perspective is you don't get to ever just enjoy the body from what I would maybe label a non-pornographic sense. Um, what I mean is, like, if you're coming from that very ultra conservative perspective, if you were to look at a girl and say, and this, I'm just giving examples, but some of these would have definitely been part of my experience and mental process too. But say you're going to youth group and it's the summertime, and girl comes up with the spaghetti strap tank top, and she's well endowed, and you're gonna, as a guy, want to look away. Of course, you're gonna want to look at her face to say hello and be friendly, but you don't want to look at her body, and you especially don't want to like stare at her. Um, and so you're kind of supposed to, you're supposed to want sex, and you're supposed to want to appreciate her beauty, but you're not supposed to look at her. So you kind of get this back and forth sense. But when you do, because you're so repressed, when you do finally give yourself that freedom to think about her, it's a hypersexual. Like it's almost like you repressed yourself so much that when you
Yeah.
finally get a chance to focus on her, you're you have a hard time focusing on just her personality and who she is. It's like she's really this beautiful girl as opposed to a whole person with a personality and a heart and maybe wounds and story. And you end up thinking of compatibility more as like she really turns me on, as opposed to are we a good match, in
Yeah.
all on all levels. But one of the things I was going to mention that really helped me a lot, and this was ironically when I was still a Christian, but I was working on a book. I still have the manuscript for it. Huge book, like 1,000 pages. It was about rediscovering the body and sexuality from a what I considered a healthy Christian perspective. Thankfully, I never published it because it would have still perpetuated the mythology. But one of the things that I did as research, and it wasn't to actually do this as a job, but I did become certified as a lactation counselor consultant, where you
Whoa.
go for like you know it's almost like it's like an intense week maybe of classes, but homework in the evenings, but it's like all week long you're with a very seasoned lactation counselor who is teaching. They're teaching nurses, they're teaching doulas, they're teaching midwives, all these people, and I was literally like the only guy among like 40 or 50 women. But they're not there's nothing pornographic, of course, about it, because they're purely like, we're just going to talk about how the body functions.
Mm.
And you're learning things about breasts, for example, and you're thinking, this is an amazing way that the body works. For example, if a baby gets sick, the mother is able to her because of the proximity of the baby with nursing, she is able to absorb it, and her milk literally changes to address exactly what the baby needs. And just endless little tidbits like that were thrown in every 5 minutes. It felt like is like, whoa, this is amazing. So you get a chance for the first time as a guy to stop looking at breasts as like, oh, this pornographic mindset thing. This is an amazing elaborate system that helps the baby and so forth. And you step back from it and you really feel like you see the body, the female body, very differently, hopefully much more healthily. And I felt like it was one of the healthiest times in my life in the way I was seeing women. And again, it wasn't to actually do the job. It was just for research for the book, but it was awesome. And I really feel bad that some guys, I think, never get the chance to just step back from that edge where it's you're married, so it's like just to have sex, or it's you're not married, and so it's like protect your mind because that's women are just so tempting, and just to say stop it, like stop it, think about it medically a little bit, like if you're not actually
Yeah.
going to be a doctor or nurse, just try a little bit, think about the body medically, and step back from that hyper erotic edge a little bit, and you really find yourself changing your perspective so dramatically. And the body in some ways ends up, the power becomes less strong over you, at least from my perspective as a man, but it becomes more powerful in the sense of you see it more artistically. And another thing, I'll just add this one last thing, and then we'll get back to your story. I was at Bob Jones University, which is a very conservative school, and they have an art gallery there, huge art gallery for Baroque art and so forth. And I was a guard, and one of the galleries there had a huge amount of Baroque art that included women who were topless. And at the time, I was like, "What is that ultra conservative Baptistic school doing with topless art in their art gallery?" And I spoke to the person that was in charge of the gallery, and they defended, like, "Look, this is beautiful art. There's nothing wrong with appreciating the body." And it
Yeah.
was one of the first times that I was able to step back from my, again, what I consider pornographic mentality, and just say, can you not look at a beautiful art? It wasn't even a photo, it was like it's artwork, hundreds of years old, artwork that someone exquisitely drew with the brush. And but it's a topless woman. Can you not just appreciate the beauty of the body without a pornographic background coming into it? And it truly again changed my perspective in what I would consider healthy. And it breaks my heart that I don't think a lot of Christian guys could go into an art gallery full of what you might label fine art nudity and not think, I shouldn't be looking at this. I feel dirty. It's like, guys, stop it. Go
Yeah.
spend some time in an art gallery with some fine art nude artwork and get yourself over this. It's not the right way to see the body. It's not.
No, I actually, good on you. That makes me excited to hear that you went and did research like that. That's like, it's just very exciting to hear that. That's really cool. It's interesting that you mentioned just the Jekyll and Hyde thing, right? Which is part of what I've studied when I've done shadow work. I know that sounds like a dark term. It's essentially just a term coined by Carl Jung, what is he, a psychiatrist. It's just a method of looking at yourself and the darker qualities you have and figuring out like who you really are in your wholeness. That's what it means.
Hmm.
But when we talk about repression, I will say I think maybe I'm wrong. It's all perception, but my perception is I've been way more sexualized by Christian men than anywhere else, to my knowledge, like and treated really poorly by Christian men because of sexuality in comparison to other men. And I do think a lot of that has to do with sexual repression. When you repress these things and you think it's bad and wrong to be sexual, um, it's a natural occurrence in the human body. And like you said, it's when you look at it medically, there's a function, there's amazing, it's amazing, and it's part of human development. And so when you can't ever look at it and it's bad and wrong, and then like the opposite sex you can't even look at and talk to and have a real relationship with, it's all surface level or sexualized or whatever, then it's kind of like you're this is my personal opinion. I just really believe there's a link to why there's so much porn being watched in the church, because it's like you can't look, you can't learn about it, nothing. And then when you're alone, you end up watching way too much porn, learning about sex through porn, and that's not even what good sex looks like, or it doesn't even feel good to do it that way for women. It's just it's not real, you know.
Yeah.
And so yeah, walking into those galleries and not even being able to appreciate it. I know what you mean.
And you can see why some cultures go to the extreme where the women are like, covered up where only their face or even only their eyes are showing. It's like this stuff, you take it to its ultimate extreme, and women need to cover up from almost from head to toe.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, just being honest, as a guy doesn't need um the coverings to, and I'm sure some girls can do this too. I don't know. I'm speaking only for myself here, but guys could see a girl in a heavy mink coat, fur, where they can't see anything but maybe her ankles. They can use their imaginations. Like it's
Yeah.
this the covering stuff, this the whole ultra modesty stuff. It doesn't matter if a guy isn't seeing a body holistically and healthily, he's going to go there. He's going to find a way to go there. Um, but I do want to ask too. I know we kind of stepped over this quickly, but going back to something you said, what was the role of women in terms of leadership? Like, could women be pastors in the groups you grew up in? And like,
Yeah.
okay, so there was a clear authority structure with men over women?
Yeah. Yeah. Like I was able to lead things like, other girls or Bible studies of girls younger, kids, But no, I never, I, when I was, it was never my ambition to be a pastor. I just was passionate about theology and wanted to help wherever I could go.
If you had seen a woman pastor, would you have been comfortable?
I probably wouldn't have thought that it was a legitimate church.
Hmm.
I remember I did hear about there was a church in the area that had a female pastor. Didn't even consider looking into it or anything. I was just like, oh, interesting.
Hmm. Yeah, I would have been the same way. Just like we're not going there. That's not a church that has real respect for the word of God. It's crazy. But in terms of going back to your story, I know we're left off with your um, the harder parts of your story with the assault and so forth. How did that play out as you aged and your relationship with the Lord and the church? What happened next in your story?
Okay, so regarding that, I wanted to hold on to, I kept the faith and I kept an open mind and an open heart, but it felt like there were snagging spots where the things I was being taught were not working or helping, like the advice that I was getting. For example, I would have now everybody knows this language, but at the time I didn't know what like a panic attack was. So I would remember that when my parents were out and I was at home alone and I was just by myself, I would just feel so alone all of a sudden when before I felt the presence of God. And so it started to feel more, I would still feel God's presence from time to time, but I felt more like there were more moments where I was just alone and I would start to shake and panic and I would be asking God to speak to me. I would be asking God to help me. And then it would just, there'd be no comfort. I would just be having these panic attacks. And it wasn't until many years later that like getting therapy actually was able to help that. But it's part of why I got into yoga, not from knowing that it's because like the panic attacks, but there was just this horrible shame, terrible shame feeling that I had. Oh, and I didn't mention that my husband and I actually, we got pregnant before we got married. We were engaged, but we got pregnant while we were engaged, same thing. So out of wedlock. And so I didn't know over time, I didn't know what like shame was. I didn't know that this terrible feeling that I accumulated from various things in life, I didn't know that that was shame. It just thought, like at our core, humans are wretched, and at our core, the belief system is that, you don't deserve anything. And I kind of thought, well, life is, I hope, am I allowed to curse?
Oh
Life
yeah.
is shitty. Life is shitty, and that's just how it is. And so you're not supposed to feel good in life anyway, right? So that, yeah, that's why part of why the mindfulness practices started to help me have more bodily awareness and stop panicking so much. But it wasn't really until I got therapy.
With the panic attacks you mentioned, was that basically just from the sexual assault earlier in your story, or was that from a whole conglomeration of things?
I think it's that I didn't adjust yet to like my parents' divorce. There's like an adjustment period. It's very jarring for kids. And so just because I'm an only child too, I just was alone a lot. And so it was like feeling alone. And then my open naivety stuff got me into dangerous situations in different times. And so there was like a lack of protection in certain ways. And so it would just be fear of loneliness and panic. And then feeling like I'm trying to do everything that I can possibly think of doing. But then like bad things keep happening. So maybe I'm just bad and wrong. You mentioned earlier something about your if you're really on point with God, you should just know what direction to go in, right? If you're really spiritually there, I remember there was a tone, and hearing about it now it makes me feel feelings. But I'm just trying to say when people would have that mentality of like, you must not be doing something, or they give you that look like, well, if you're having that problem, like, there must be something wrong. It makes me really angry now because so many people would have that mentality, but I was doing the best I could. And I was. And there's always like this sense that they don't believe you, or they don't, like there must be something, you must be like horribly sinful, something deep inside you, just an evil, bad person. And they're just questioning you, don't believe you. That really got to me. And I just felt like there must be just, maybe I just can't fix it. And I'm just like a terrible person. Not
Hmm.
that I believed people were good or were good because of the belief system, but I thought there must be something like just wrong with me, you know?
Yeah. I think that's what you just said is one of the most um, relatable things and profoundly disturbing things about Christianity is that you are set up to think that especially as you get more and more years under your belt as a Christian, and hopefully you're therefore in the word more, you're under solid biblical teaching and preaching more, you're able to parse the word of God and divide it rightly, that there's a maturity that will come, and especially with your prayer life, you sought God, you're listening to God more than ever, that Jesus talks about his yoke is easy, his burden is light. You can cast all your cares on the Lord because he cares for you. He will give you this peace that passes all understanding. And the joy of the Lord will fill your heart. And you're like, you know what? I don't have that much joy. I don't have that much peace. His yoke isn't very easy. In fact, it feels quite heavy. And I don't have peace that passes all understanding. And I think I'm casting my cares on the Lord, but I don't feel like they're going anywhere. They seem like they're pretty much staying on me. And so you end up with this real conundrum where you're like, what the hell is wrong with me? Like, why am I not experiencing the joy of the Lord? Because if we of all people, like if we have been to proverbially to the depths of hell in the sense of we were destined for it and we were there apart from, we were already condemned, John 3 says we're condemned without Christ, therefore we've now experienced this being dying with Christ and then being raised again. We've experienced the most miraculous, amazing experience that we could possibly have. And the biggest forgiveness that we needed, we got in abundance. We went from being, owing a trillion dollars in debt to having a trillion dollars in excess in terms of the glory and the beauty that God has given to us, and the covering us with his righteousness. Like, you have gone from rags to riches in the best sense possible. Why would you possibly be sad? I mean, it'd be like if you had this movie of someone that literally was, dying of cancer and on the street in a box with nothing but, half a bottle of liquor left. And they pretty much expect to die either from the lack of food or the cold or the cancer. And something happens and a doctor is able to give them a miracle cure. Your cancer is gone, and I'm going to give you endless riches, and you're going to go live in a mansion. It's like, how in the world would that person be sad? Like, but that's what the way they present it. It's like, what the hell is wrong with you? You've got everything you need. And you've got more. Like, it isn't just like, well, God gave it to you and walked away. He's still right there guiding you and helping you. His spirit's in you. You should have ultimate peace and happiness and joy. And then when you don't, you're like, I don't know what to do with this. I feel messed up. And especially when you're bringing, traumatic experiences, you're like, oh my gosh, like what? And then if you think, the Instagram, Christian Instagram world, so to speak, everyone else is happy, everyone else is
Yeah,
preaching in the, singing in the choir with a smile on their face. I guess I'm the person on the outside, and yeah, it tears you apart.
it does. Oh my gosh, the Instagram Christianity. Yeah. Everybody looking exactly the same. I don't want to, I mean, sometimes it's nice to see that stuff. I want to see people are happy and
Yeah,
enjoying their lives and taking cute pictures. I like that. Who doesn't? But I started to be like, everybody looks like this and I look like this. And so I like kept trying to look like the other thing, but it just wasn't authentic. And so then that felt wrong. So as people were starting to go to seminary, I understood like that what our system was Calvinism and the predestination and how God's chosen you. And it started to be like, in the beginning, I was saying how I never feared to lose my salvation or anything because that I knew that I had professed my faith and I knew this, but it started to feel like, you know, maybe God didn't choose me. And whether or not you're predestined, it's not like not like up to us. There's nothing you can do about that. So
So
it
you
kind of
you
started to
literally
seem
began to fear that?
hopeless. I began to think, how come it's not looking how it should? And I started to not feel, I started to have like issues with lots of different topics and lots of different verses. And I just felt like these methods weren't working. But then I had that battle of like, well, like life has suffering and not everything has to work for me. And I don't have to be okay with everything. But it was really just things just kept happening to my friends and in the world and in my life. And it's like, this just isn't adding up. And I have so many doubts. And I know it's okay to have doubts as long as but then it was a constant battle all of a sudden. And it was like, maybe I'm not predestined, but that can't be. So I just kept doing research.
So you were fearing that you might not have been one of the elect at that point?
Yeah, if I just didn't, I stopped agreeing
Hmm.
with it.
You mentioned the word
Yeah.
doubts. What were some of the doubts you were having at that point in your story?
At first, the doubts were more that I was in the proper denomination. I felt like the denomination that I was in was not how Jesus acted or behaved or how he wanted people to behave. So me and my husband, we both have different journeys, but when we got married, I actually did go through a phase of atheism for a little while where I like read God is not great. I did all the research that I could on different ways of belief because I felt that the way that the denomination that I was in was trying to help us in our marriage and figure out all this. It wasn't helping, and we were just having all these problems, and it just felt like it was only getting worse. And my depression, I had never had an issue with deep depression before that, but it was so bad. And you know how postpartum can also play a role in that. But I was just trying to figure it out. And then I decided that I addressed my doubts with researching other ways of believing, and atheism seemed to really resonate with me. But then I went back into the faith because also my husband and I were never until now like at the same place. And so when I was researching atheism, he was a Christian. And when he was more agnostic, I was a Christian. And so it was like, I thought, okay, I'll pray. And I started to feel that feeling of the spirit coming back to me. And so I started to just bring my doubts. And what ended up happening is we left the church, we stopped going. My husband and I were traveling a lot for his work. We actually lived in Georgia for like 8 months twice for his work. And what happened was we were so saturated in the Southern Baptist world that I was sheltered from. So since I'm from Southern California, this area is like movie industry. Like that's even like our livelihood is like everything is movie industry. And so I'm like, everything is, subliminal messages trying to get to the kids and all this evil is here. And so you have to be so strong as a Christian here. But then I went out there and there was a church everywhere, every single corner that you look, and the culture, it's this. And I started to understand things I never understood about Christian culture until I was there. And I just was like, I just want to study the Bible and learn what the original Christians were like. And so then I got an interlinear Bible. I almost brought it to show you. It's this big fat book that has the Greek and the Hebrew and then like literal translation I was comparing. And then I had theology books lent to me. I was scouring YouTube. I was super into the conspiracy theories. It got to the point where I didn't believe in any conventional current church was what it was the original intent. And so I was just trying to raise, at the time I had like two young kids. I was just trying to raise them off, like showing them nature, talking about the character of God and trying to just do it myself and ourselves with our little family unit. And like, hopefully someday we'll find a community. And so the doubts and asking questions, was just very I was very confident that I would find the answers that I was looking for. I found different answers than what I was expecting. But yeah, I
It's
don't know if that
amazing.
answered your question.
It's amazing how that works. Where in Georgia were you, by the way?
We were in Atlanta.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm just 20 minutes north in Alpharetta.
Okay, cool.
Um, when you mentioned the doubts and the things that weren't, you were hoping to have answers and it didn't work out, what kind of things were, you don't have to be super specific, but just what areas and genres of information were you digging into that you were surprised by some of the answers you got?
I eventually found Gnosticism and things like that. Just seeing how the different original little tribes kind of broke off and how the Catholic Church eventually developed and how Constantine had put the Bible together and all of that stuff. And I was just convinced that the current system is corrupt because I honestly, the doubts came from there are trends through time of they would decide certain verses are suddenly what everyone cares about and that would change. I don't have the examples now because it's been so long, but I remember there was like one time where like this verse was a thing and so everything of that culture was based off that and then it's another one and they're always changing the narrative of what matters the most. That was kind of what I was looking into at the time. But in Gnosticism, maybe was it Gnosticism where there was like the idea of like the demiurge,
Hmm.
where it's just like, do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah,
You do.
very
I
much
think
so.
I've heard you actually talk about it, where it's the idea that maybe the God of the Bible could be evil or
Yeah.
just perceiving the narrative in different ways and how different people had a different perception. And by that time, I had studied yogic philosophy and Eastern philosophy, which they so try to guard you against understanding. And I also love Greek mythology. And you start to see patterns to, there's usually in pantheons, there are little branches. It started to realize that like the thing was happening with the Bible too, that there's different pantheons and it was like it blew my mind. I was super freaked out and paranoid during that time period. It was a
Mm.
lot to it was a lot to think about. Um, but I was going to say something about the Gnosticism. Right. Okay, so in Eastern philosophy, there were things in the Bible that I didn't understand that made no sense and that we have interpretations for nowadays that take the Bible literally. But if you study like symbolism and different myths, you realize there are symbols that existed in different time periods that were common knowledge. So there are phrases in the Bible that make sense when you understand Eastern philosophy. And so at first I was like, okay, so we're just interpreting the Bible incorrectly. And there's a lot of wisdom and knowledge here. And it's just more, I became more of like a mystic, which is kind of where my Janine the Alchemist thing comes from, because alchemy is just it's a transformation like the butterfly in the cocoon. And it's just kind of escalated from there where I now see the Bible as an amazing work like the Iliad, and there's truth in it, but it's no different to me than the Iliad
Yeah.
or the Bhagavad Gita. Yeah.
It's interesting too how so many people don't realize that there are, and this is something I'm not prepared to speak to in too much depth because it's something I've done some studying on, but I'd want to dot my I's and cross my T's really carefully before I begin an actual, monologue about it. But to realize that there are a lot of Buddhist philosophies woven into Christianity, which, Buddhism was much earlier, and a lot of Mithraism, which was from, really flourished in India before Christ. Mithraism took over the Roman Empire because, Mithras was a warrior, demigod, and the Romans were looking at that. They were warriors, the military men, and seeing that as like, okay, we can really worship this guy because he's a warrior like us. He's a soldier. He was always seen as slaying the bull, killing the bull, and so forth. And a lot of Christianity is heavily influenced by Mithraism,
Yeah.
and you're like, but that thrived in India, and Buddhism was woven in heavily to Christianity, and you don't hear any of that stuff in Christian in
They would
church or in
never.
Christian college. But when you dig into it really deeply, you're like, oh my gosh, like, and you tend to think as a Christian, and at least I did, that so many of these religions popped up after Christ as a way to kind of counterfeit Christianity. But then when you really dig into the timelines, you realize a lot of these were there hundreds, if not thousands of years before Christ. And the Christianity would, basically evolved and flourished and grew up in the context where all these other religions and mystery cults were already completely in control. And then when you realize just the motifs are carrying through, like especially with the Greek gods. And I know I've said some of this stuff recently, but it's been on my mind because I'm working on a kid's book for it, trying to help my own kids to understand the parallels. But like just to give a few quick examples, when you look at Helios, the sun god, he was known as wearing a purple robe, and he had the sun rays around his head with like a crown. And so Jesus is portrayed as having a purple robe and a crown of thorns. You have Hermes with his golden slippers with the wings on them, the Flash. Hermes could walk on the water, and Jesus could do the same exact thing. Other gods could too, but Hermes, especially, he was a son of God, a son of Zeus. Zeus would cry drops of, tears that were like drops of blood and water. Jesus, the same thing in Gethsemane. And Dionysius, of course, could turn water into wine. And there's hundreds of these things woven into the Bible. But then you also, one of the things that I think is so cool that just blows my mind is the little things that once you see them, it's not just an interesting tidbit, it changes the way you look for other tidbits in there. What I mean is this, um, in the New Testament, um, Jesus is healing a blind man, and his name is the son of Timaeus. His name is Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus. Well, everybody knew that Plato's big work was the Timaeus. So Jesus heals somebody called the son of Timaeus. And then in Homer's Odyssey, there is a person named Emmaus, and Jesus, as he's revealing himself, it's on the road to Emmaus. And little things like numbers that don't make sense, like the 153 fish with obviously
Yes, the
Pythagoras.
numbers.
But then once you start to see those, you're like, okay, my spidey senses are up. There's other stuff here. So when Jesus says things like, go to the upper room and prepare the meal for us in the upper room, you begin to think, I wonder if that means something. And then you look at names like Joseph of Arimathea. I wonder what that means. And Mary the Magdalene. I wonder what that word Magdalene means. And it just tips you off, because if they did it with Bartimaeus and the road to Emmaus, um, they're probably doing it with other names. And it's kind of like, John Bunyan with Pilgrim's Progress, where
Yeah.
somebody's name has the meaning right in their name. It's like that. And you don't realize it when you're growing up because you never talk about it. You realize that they're literally weaving puns and like ironies into people's names and the names of things. And once you see it, you're
Yeah.
like, oh my gosh, there is a whole different ball game going on here, than I thought of. I just thought this was just a literal story, and these were people's actual names, as opposed to they were, but the people that would have originally heard this stuff would have picked up on a lot of it. They would have, I see what you're doing there. I see what you're doing there. We missed it because the church, kind of ignored that stuff.
Exactly. So that's the stuff I was like nerding out about, was the root words. And some things correspond to your body, some things are words for the spirit. And then eventually when I like read when I got into like Taoism and I read the Tao Te Ching, it was like
Yeah.
I now have this belief. This is why it's like I'm not saying throw it away. I'm just I would just like I would like everyone to be educated on what is it saying, you know?
Yeah.
What is it really trying to tell you? Which parts are manipulation, which parts are a story with like a good message. And then there's things in there about like your actual physical body. There's stuff about meditation that's in everything, but then they say meditation's evil. There's all kinds of stuff in there.
Mm.
Yeah. And when you said about Dionysus, yeah, that was something that kind of played a part in things kind of falling away for me. Things like definitions of, for example, the definition of hell and finding out the actual translation of that, and then also seeing similarities between him and Dionysus. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. And then also the other thing was the virgin birth. but there's a lot of myths before with a virgin birth, very similar to Christ, and also how Christ's story corresponds with the seasons and the way that the sun behaves around Easter and how it looks like it stays in one place for 3 days. All these things, great. Astrology, I'm sorry, yeah, astrology and astronomy are in a lot of these old texts.
Yeah.
It's probably what helps them last for so long.
Yeah. And just to give a quick plug too for Bill Darlison, I interviewed him a long time ago, but he's written a couple of books. One of them is The Celestial Journey of the Soul, but he's got other books too. But talking
I'm gonna
about
write that down.
the gospel, the zodiac and the gospel is another one. I think this is The Celestial Journey of the Soul is just like an evolution of that book, but the zodiac and the Gospel of Mark. Just the idea of realizing that the Gospel of Mark is structured according to the signs of the zodiac in the right order, and you just your mind gets blown. But that I do want to ask you too about this other aspect of it. It's very separate. How did you deal with the bizarre stories as well as the atrocious and murderous genocidal stories? Did that play a part of your journey in terms of how you thought through this?
It does. Now, I want you to know I'm not a very political person, and so I don't want to sound political, but this is my genuine reaction to everything that I learned. So I've come to know more Indigenous people because of my job and things. And when I was first studying it, I thought, every old story has these atrocities, right? But the weight of what what would the word be? The Crusades and like all of these, the weight of that and how it has affected cultures, including my ancestry, um, becomes more heart-wrenching the more that you realize like the world has changed, but it also hasn't in many ways. We've evolved, but we still have these terrible things in our nature, I guess, the good and the bad. But I'm just the weight of what the Bible says is okay to God and how that has sometimes informed either not caring at all about other people's pain because you're in the right. And so who cares about the collateral damage and the weight of just what has actually happened and how people's lives have been taken away and stripped. And it just, it's still hard for me to, I'm still processing it. I'm still processing.
Hmm.
Yeah. Like a good example is I remember in my church, they would try to differentiate themselves from the Crusades because that was Catholics. That was one bad man who came and took over those natives. But that's not true. It happens all the time, over and over and over again. And we still do it now. We just do it differently.
Hmm.
We go places where people are not, I like I said, there are well-meaning people and there are people who help. And that's actually why I was so attracted to the faith in the first place, is the service toward others. But we do go to vulnerable places and help them and say we're helping them, but there's like a cost, which is giving them the gospel. Like we're giving them the gospel while we're helping them. I think sometimes there's something wrong about that and gross.
Yeah, very colonial perspective, as other people have pointed out. Yeah, we will help you, but you have to end up looking like us and thinking like us and changing your worldview to be like us. I remember in a very simplistic sense, that's exactly what I used to be involved with a lot of soup kitchen work. I grew up outside of Philly, and there's a suburb of Philadelphia called Chester, and it's a large part of it is very poor. Like it's one of the poorest parts of the country, at least at the time I was involved with it. And I did endless work there, soup kitchen work, working at Chester High, tutoring kids, preaching in the street, just endless stuff. Working with really what I would have considered at that time a good school, Frederick Douglass Christian School, just loving on the kids, loving them, playing with them. But the soup kitchen work I did there in Chester, it was very basically, people would file in and sit down, and they would know that you don't get your soup and your bread until you wait for the first hour to pass, which is when I get to come up and, probably, it's someone else leading a few hymns, and then I get to preach for 30 minutes. Of course, the big push is the gospel. We're not going to exegete the book of Esther here. We want to get you saved, because if you're homeless, there's a higher chance you're going to not survive the night or what have you. So let's talk about the gospel and get you saved in case you die tonight. But you're not
That's
getting your bread
wild.
and your soup until you're done listening to me preach. And did that for years, to my shame. But yeah, it's very much like that. And then the overseas missions is very much like that, with especially with evangelical Christianity. We want you to end up having a church that's like ours, planted. You can have a little cultural, dynamic going on there, but you're basically going to be assimilated. We're
Yeah.
I'm sounding like I'm talking about Star Trek and the Borg there, but resistance is futile. The thing
Resistance
about
is futile.
the bad stuff too, and I totally agree with you. The Crusades and other stories like that were bad, but even like within the text, did that get at you in terms of like, you can go take over people's land, and you can steal their land, you can kill most everybody, but you can take some slaves in some cases, and you can certainly take the young girls as either child brides or worse. And if you take them and you have sex with them and you don't find them pleasing, you can send them away, shave their head and let them grieve, and then send them on their way. But endless stories like that. Stoning people that weren't virgins, stoning gay people, stoning children that were disobedient. On and on that could go. We could talk about that for hours. But did that, realizing it's in the text, not just as like God said, I'm observing that you're doing it, but He's saying, I want you to do this in my name. Did that affect you at all?
It did affect me when the story where the father is like, don't harm the men, take my daughter. Like that did bother me, but I remembered it would always be like, that's not God, that's the people. God didn't say that that was okay. That's the people and their terribleness. And I actually, you'd be like, well, that's the Old Testament, there's the New Testament, and there are things in the New Testament, but I didn't think about what you're saying in depth, except there was, okay, I guess I would have more of like a question. There's that story where, was she a prostitute and she lied to protect them from
Oh yeah.
what story was that? That was like,
Yeah, that was when the spies, I think it was in Joshua, where the spies came in, Joshua and Caleb, and I think it was Rahab, was it? Rahab
yeah,
protected them and let them down through a little
that's exactly it.
rope or
Yeah.
something. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was like, but she was allowed to lie, and my brain was like, but why was lying okay in that? But it was to save them, but it's lying. um but it wasn't until later when I had more real, not that my life wasn't real before and I didn't go through anything, but once I had kids and I had more real world things to work through, that I was able to see that these are the things that help people justify things. So it's kind of like, well, that was okay because they weren't God's people. Like how were God's people supposed to be there if there were people there, and you can't mix with the people because, well, they're corrupted and evil, and so you got to just get rid of them. What else? It's like when you start to see, well, like, what if that was actually happening in front of you? What would that look like? And that looks like the Holocaust to
Yeah.
me. Stuff like that. Very terrible.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think too, one of the big things that a lot of people have appropriately pushed this button on is slavery, where the Old Testament not just teaches slavery, but it says that you can beat your slaves, and as long as they don't die from the beating, then you're fine. And it's like, all right, come on, we have to have a problem at some point, with treating each other this way.
The slave Bible. Have you heard of that?
I have, yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Where
yes,
it's a different version of the Bible that was given to the slaves that had some things taken out so that they wouldn't be as free.
yeah,
And so what makes you think that's not the Bible, that you don't have a version of that now, you
right,
know?
yeah, that's a good point. And and very much so that there are different versions of the Bible. Then we don't have the whole thing. There's at least 60 Gospels. And originally there were probably hundreds of different versions of the Gospels, and probably dozens of versions of each of the ones that we did end up with in the canon. Yeah, and I mean, 9 different endings to the Gospel of Mark. It's like, it's endless. The issues that you end up realizing, this book, it just doesn't look very divine. I mean, this is this the best God could do? because it doesn't look very much like a good book. And if he's the mastermind and he's brilliant beyond comparison, this looks like it's kind of woven together by some people that tried their best at the time, but were very much in the ancient world, borrowing each other's ideas and then just kind of hodgepodging it together and hoping you didn't quite notice all the discrepancies. It doesn't look very divine at all. When you mentioned though your husband, he was deconstructing before you. Tell us more about that. How did that play out, and how did you all? Are you all got through it obviously together?
Yeah. We got it through it. We are not the same. Whereas I'm more comfortable with, I feel really comfortable talking to atheists. Like I don't really define what I am, but I'd say that's closest. I'm open to learning. There's a lot to learn about the world. So that's kind of I'm comfortable with not knowing exactly what might be going on here. But he's more spiritual than I am in yogic philosophy. It's really beautiful into Taoism and stuff like that.
Hmm.
But he grew up in a more strict home than me, and he went to a private Christian school, and he was going through like feeling agnostic um while we were dating, and I remember being so scared and feeling like just trying to get him back. And then he came back to the faith, and then when we got married, I became an atheist, and then I tried again, and then I landed kind of where I'm at, and then he and we're in a very close place, I guess. We're near each other, I guess.
Hmm. When you were on different wavelengths, how did you all handle that? Was it fairly consistently respectful and, just you pursue the questions you need. I don't need to answer those questions now, or I think I've already got those questions answered. Like, was it respectful, or was there ever any conflict and strife over why don't you think like I do?
It was very hard. It was very hard, extremely difficult from my perspective when he was a Christian, and I would say it it was a lot of me. It was a lot of me, and that was hard because it was just frustrating fundamentally, and our marriage really suffered a lot until we landed closer to each other. You know, we almost didn't make it because of our fundamental differences in like
Mm,
fighting, and I didn't want to live in like I am a more what is it? I am a more submissive, like feminine type. So I like a dominant male. It's just that I didn't want to live by like the traditional gender roles. Like I wanted to work, I wanted to get more education. And I know that not every Christian family is against that, but we were more traditional.
mhm,
I wanted my feelings and my thoughts to matter more, I guess. And then it's funny, my husband's a very empathetic person, but it was a lot of struggle, internal struggle for both of us. It was very hard. So I
mm.
think it's incredible if anyone makes it. That's what I think.
It is very difficult, and especially I think if one person just is ultra conservative and strictly evangelical, strictly into inerrancy, and you've never, Christianity isn't just this set of beliefs; it's also this set of beliefs wrapped around by a culture of what I would consider um, very protective of each other and very stifling of dissent, and very much kind of saying we want it to be insulated against the world and against other ideas. It's very much a black and white. It's us versus them. And so if you've grown up always thinking, I know I've got the right answer, and I'm obviously going to marry someone who's in my group, and you marry that person, and they suddenly say, I actually don't think we might have the wrong answers.
Yeah,
You're like,
yeah.
wait a second, like we married with the intention of perpetuating our worldview. Like this, we're raising soldiers for Christ with this particular worldview. We're not just Christians, we're a specific subset of Christians who have the true interpretation. And if you marry with that understanding and then one of you diverges, case in point, myself, but one of you diverges, I mean, for the other person, if they've never seen that, it is hell on earth, and it can completely destroy, your your marriage. I mean, it really can. But I'm glad you all survived it. Do you feel like you've landed where you are going to land? Like, I'll just ask, where have you landed? Do you think there's anything divine out there? Do you think there's an afterlife?
I think life is divine. I don't want to get too like metaphysical, but I like the ideas of like the quantum world. I'm saying I like them as I say I like it, whereas I'm open to it not being fully spot on, but I think it reflects what I see in nature. It reflects science. So what maybe and I wanted to bring this up, that feeling that comes over people that they feel is like the presence of God. As a doula, I've been in a lot of different homes with different faiths and some people without faith of any kind, and they're more just spiritual, just, every human experiences these things. And what I've come to realize is we all have the same experiences and we all have the same essence. And so maybe the energy that runs through us, that's what we perceive as the soul, whether or not we're conscious or after the fact, or maybe we break up and are recycled. I don't know the answer, but I love to learn, so I'm interested. And I guess where I've landed in just we're all the same. Life is really beautiful and scary. There's like light and dark. We're not just fully horribly evil humans. We like to fix things and grow things, and it's like it's life's what you make it. That's what I think.
Yeah.
I hope that's a good answer. It's not very clear, but I love studying culture and I love studying people. So I like to know about what people perceive as like sacred, or why people do ritual, or why we create beliefs and where certain things come from, and not just get rid of it all, but find wisdom in it. So that's not a very clear answer. I may land somewhere else, but I think I'm landed at I don't know that there is this one entity that looks down at us or is amidst us. I think we are God. I think like anything we've written about God is the way that we're perceiving it.
Hmm.
We've created God in our image. That's what I think.
Regarding the afterlife, if you either already think this, or if you could somehow find out that there is absolutely no afterlife, you just, when you're dead, you're dead. How would that affect how you view life, and would that make you sad, or are you at peace with the concept that this may be it?
I think that used to scare me. I guess I'd love to live forever, but I think I have peace. I think I have peace about it because I do think I'm doing the best I can to live this life. And I think that that's what you lose when, from my personal experience as a Christian, you forget to live now and you forget what's important and what's right in front of you, and you don't really connect to what's in front of you. Sometimes we're kind of like people walk around, we're kind of like floating heads, very disconnected from what's happening. So I think being present and being grounded and orienting to what's here, you can actually do a lot more. So if I did my best, then that's all I could do. And hopefully the generation after does better. But yeah, I don't know if that's very clear. That might frust. I know that that answer frustrates people because a lot of people are not okay with paradox.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you were a Christian, did the idea of praising God forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever
No,
appeal to you?
it sounded like I was like, it must not be like what I think it would be because that sounds terrible. I'm like, it must be something else that I can't. It has to be better than what that sounds like.
Hmm. I will admit, I took a very transcendent route, and you mentioned Gnosticism. I don't think I was a Gnostic, but in the sense of they often are looking at it from a transcendent perspective. It it blew my mind thinking about it, and I did want to live forever, and I did want to worship God forever. I think of it as like, you know how the Book of Revelation is talks about the new Jerusalem is like jewels and gold, streets of gold.
Yeah.
And I thought, there's certain crystals that, like, for me, a really high end, super expensive opal. If you could ever, I've seen pictures of them on the internet. If I could ever see one in real life, I think I would be tempted, if I could find a context to do it. I just would be like, can everyone just leave me alone? Just let me sit and stare at this opal for like an hour or two. Like it's just a stone and it's sparkly, but every little tidbit of movement and it's going to look a little different and sparkle differently. And I would have thought this is a beautiful stone. And then you weave in, you know, rubies and diamonds or whatever. And if you were looking at something like that, and then you were to maybe weave in not crystals and rocks and things, but artwork to say, what about the most beautiful art, whatever it is, if you really love impressionism or you love Baroque art, just or all of it, whatever, fill your mind with an art gallery with the most beautiful art you could imagine. And imagine, like, just pick a name. Say you love Monet and you love all the great work that, the impressionist work that he did. But you could stare at his paintings, but then imagine that there was like 10,000 other works of art that he had done that no one had ever seen that were even more amazing of the same genre. And then you multiply that by a billion artists that are also going to stun you, and you weave in the all of the crystals and looking at the the beauty of the shininess of them all and the artwork, and then you weave in things like traveling to like planets. Like, I loved Star Trek and Star Wars. I was a Trekkie or a sci-fi guy. Imagining, and Stargate. I love Stargate. I hope they're bringing that back and do some more with it. But the idea of traveling through wormholes and through galaxies, and you could do it forever and ever and ever, and you'd never, like, I would never personally think, if I could travel between galaxies and just see the stars zooming past me, I don't think I'd ever get used to the beauty of that. I just want to sit there and do it forever. You weave all that in, and then you times it by a trillion trillion trillion, because obviously God is much 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 better than that. And then you weave in the gospel, the grace that he saved you. And then you weave in the idea of he wasn't just saving people, he was doing something in history, like a tapestry where on the front end it looked like these frayed, threads, but you flip it and it's a beautiful picture. And you would just think, oh my freaking God, this is amazing. I can't believe, God, you were doing that this whole time. You weave all that stuff in and then some. I wanted to stare at his glory in his face forever. And I don't think I would have ever, as a Christian, would have said that would ever tire me. And I would have loved to just sing his praises, not necessarily sing him audibly as like hymn number, stanza number 3, like just sing it from your heart, from your, as if it was an ESP kind of thing. Sing from your heart to the Lord. Look at what he has done. Look at who he is. That enraptured me forever. It devastated me that eternity was not a thing. I was like, I cannot believe that's not real anymore. It broke my heart. It still, Christianity broke my heart. It still does. But I dealt with it and I'm still dealing with it. I would say if there's a couple PTSDs, I would say that's one of them, the PTSD of losing eternity. I know some people
Yeah,
say, no, you'd get bored. It would take a lot for me to be convinced that I'd get too bored of looking at something like that. But anyway,
I agree. You have an amazing imagination because once you described that, I was suddenly like, yeah, let's go.
yeah.
Let's go there. But see, that's what I see this as. Like when I said we created God in like our image, what I'm saying is we have observed this incredible thing and then we've written it down. So to me, that does exist right now for me,
Hmm. Like in
I
our
guess.
minds.
Well, just I could make it a mission. Of course, you have to decide what you want to do first, but I think that to me, everything is that beautiful.
Hmm.
I think it's because of that idea of heaven is not there. I think life is really beautiful, very extremely mesmerizing and gorgeous
Hmm.
because of that. Because
Yeah.
of realizing that we've written down what we've seen and we've said heaven, we've said streets of gold and stuff like that. In different religions, they say that, or like a big mansion, and it's like we have that, we can see that.
Yeah. And I think just a parallel thought to that too is that because those of us who do think that life does stop the moment that our brains stop, that we do have one life and that's it. Like myself, I do feel like that's the only evidence I've got so far. That's what happens. It makes the beauty of life even more precious. So you'd say whatever, like you look as a doula, you look at the beauty of childbirth and of a newborn and the love of new parents and the baby, so forth, and just the the loveliness of it. I was present for our four babies' birth. I literally, was the one cutting the cord and so forth, and three of our four were home births. So I was right there,
Oh,
catching the baby. It's like it's so beautiful. But then, like you're saying, like I'm saying, when you realize this might be it, it's like cherish those moments because this probably is it. Like those moments are not a reflection of something much bigger and more beautiful. This isn't a shadow of the beauty to come. This is the beauty to come. Your life is right now. Make the most of it. Tomorrow's not promised. Hug those babies, as they say.
that's very interesting that you say that because oftentimes you're not living in the present when you are a Christian in the denomination I grew up in. It's all about the future.
Mm.
And so you are missing your life. And I'm speaking from personal experience, but also I've spoken to a lot of people. They tend to, it seems to me like they're missing a lot of what's actually going on. And that I
Yeah.
think that's what it robs you from your real sensory experience and addressing the real things that are happening. And I do think spiritual experiences are important and they are, it's part of the human experience and they give meaning to things. Um, but it's important to live in the present.
Do you feel like that would affect too, like people's perspective on suffering? Like, just deal with suffering because suffering is only for a short time. It's, this is like a blink of an eye. The suffering will end and then everything will be wonderful. Do you feel like some people end up enduring suffering that they could otherwise perhaps push against? And I mean suffering like, something happened to you, a car accident, you had nothing, you couldn't have stopped it, it happened to you. But if there's suffering where, for example, a lady is in an abusive marriage and her husband's beating the shit out of her every few weeks, um, they used to tell women a lot more, I think, look, divorce, God hates divorce, but also like, you're suffering for a little bit. God's going to make all this right in heaven. Don't worry about it too much right now. Do you think that, do you
Yeah.
resonate with that at all?
Yeah. People absolutely keep suffering when they don't need to. I think because of that, um, or they think maybe they deserve it because of their nature. But yeah, I do think people will suffer or become complacent or they don't. I know passionate Christians, but I think that there are a lot of Christians who have no drive to better the world because they're already going to heaven and all they have to do is give the gospel and they don't really have to physically help improve anything while they're here. Like I do think that people endure suffering maybe when they don't need to. And also for me, when I was younger, I had suffered from suicidal thoughts because I thought I wasn't getting it right or the intrusive thoughts, not knowing how to deal with that. I do think, even though like some people think you'd go to hell and then suffer forever, for me, it's that I started just believing life is suffering. And that can be true, but it's not, yeah, suffering is temporary and we can get through it and life can improve and change. There's a lot of change that
Yeah.
occurs. There's not a lot of change in the Bible, I don't think, but change occurs in
Yeah.
nature.
Especially thinking that God's doing it, like God's specifically making you suffer to make you more of a useful vessel for his glory. It really it twists reality so badly. I know I've kept you for a while. I do want to ask to kind of get to the punchline too of this. What was the moment like when you just said to yourself, in your head or out loud, um, I'm not a Christian? Like what was that like when it hit you? Was it a day, an hour? Was it a just like reflecting, oh yeah, I guess I'm not a Christian anymore, but I probably wasn't a Christian 6 months ago. Like how did that play out in terms of a time frame and when you said it to yourself out loud? And maybe as a corollary, once you realized it and eventually became, vocal enough, at least for your loved ones to know that, how did people begin to respond to your journey?
That's really interesting. It's interesting to be asked the questions because usually nobody asks when you leave. Um, so it's been a very long journey for me, in my opinion. It's been a lot of stripping away and trying to figure it out for a few years. I couldn't say it I couldn't say it for so long. And I sort of alluded to it with friends a lot and tried to be open about that dialogue. But as I saw my friendships kind of falling apart and realizing like it can't go on, there's like the sadness of friendships that you can never be truly close with people. And so my husband and I had talked about it, but when I really was brave enough to say it was after there was a lot of times when I was talking to people on my Facebook and then I stopped having a Facebook because I didn't want to do that anymore. But on Instagram, I started to say what I thought in my stories and I started to have a lot of back and forth with people. And I realized that I might be being hard on myself, but I felt like I was a coward. I was not able to say it. And I would still say, I believe I'm a Christian, but I just don't believe it the same way. Maybe you would say I'm not, but I think I am because I believe that there's like ultimate truths in all the different texts. And I was unable to admit it. And it wasn't until, and this is very interesting, until I made a deconstruction video a couple months ago. And I felt very strongly that it was time to, I had to say it because of how many times I was talking to people on Instagram about it. And it was like this, it was a thing where it kept being a thing where people would want to talk. And I was like, I'm going to make this one video and it will make everything make sense and very clear for everybody. If they want to know, kind of, if they're curious, they'll just watch this and I won't have to think about it. So I would tell you, it was not until like maybe a month or two ago that I felt comfortable saying for sure, like I'm not a Christian, and that's just not that's not what I believe. I'm not going to minimize the impact of the work, but I'm not a Christian. It wasn't until I made that video and said it and realized like, oh, I've been afraid to say it because I was afraid of the social repercussions because I love people and I don't want people to be worried about me. And I'm actually really happy and my marriage is thriving. And it's strange. Everything's going great, but I just didn't want everybody to suddenly be so sad about you. So incredibly sad about you when you're actually happy. Yeah.
Hmm. What else besides them being sad? What other responses have you gotten from people?
Well, when I made it clear, I did receive some messages of people concerned. I felt kind of offended, to be honest, to not be spoken to by people. And then when you say you're not a believer, then they suddenly talk to you, like, well, where were you when I was going through it? But I don't know. I don't know.
Hmm.
I yeah, I don't
Did
know.
anybody treat you with hatred or like a traitor or shun you?
No, I guess a form of shunning would be there's a lot of people just I know a lot of great people. It's just that there's a very obvious um moment where you no longer have a close relationship with them. Everything is shallow from then on. That was hard for me, which is why I didn't want to tell people is I started to tell people closer to me and then suddenly everything is shallow. So that was hard for me.
Shallow, like because you just all they want to talk about is Jesus and the Bible, and you weren't going to go there.
Know that they will no longer be deep with me. Like the friendship is no
Okay,
longer this. It's no longer like it's because you're almost like an acquaintance all of a sudden. Like now they're speaking only small talk to you. That's kind of it was jarring because a lot of people just did it when I started to commit more to my yoga career. I think I was put in a category of, well, she's obviously not a Christian. So I didn't even have to tell people. People just started to treat me that way. And
hmm.
then it's like, well, I'm just going to tell everyone. And then it's just now everyone's suddenly really nice to me because I think they want me to come back. But I
Yeah,
feel that, yeah, it's tricky.
that's interesting. I'm glad though. It sounds like in some ways your journey has not been one of too many attacks, and maybe I hope I'm not predicting anything there that starts to happen. But
Maybe.
who knows? Maybe it's just waiting. But for a lot of us, it has definitely been being treated like you're a traitor, and you
Yeah.
you know can imagine the hatred and so forth. But I guess it depends on how, how connected you were at the exact time when you were deconverted, and, whether or not you were in a more liberal group where they were open to some, well, you're allowed to have a divergent view or not. I know progressive Christianity, if you were, in those kind of groups and then moving away, it's probably, I would guess, a lot easier to be fully deconverted from a progressive Christian perspective as opposed to obviously a fundamentalist evangelical perspective. Um, did want to just kind of open up the floor to also ask, what else is on your heart in terms of just your messaging for people. You mentioned your YouTube channel. Like, if you were to imagine at this point taking your talents and your interests and your passions based on your journey and what you know and what you've been through, and assuming the best, you're going to live a very long, healthy life. What would you like to see the rest of your life, and even the next 5 to 10 years? What would you like to see yourself doing as it relates to the deconverting and deconstructing community?
Wow. Well, for me, my mortality became a bigger deal, right? So that's why I started making videos, was to process my thoughts and to so I was putting out a lot of like shadow work because I wanted people to know about it. And that term is scary to Christians because it sounds like you're doing some witchcraft or something. But it's really, it's all the symbolism displayed in art and how we perceive our lives and our human behavior and acknowledging even the parts we don't like. So I would love to help people to be more comfortable acknowledging parts of themselves that they would rather not even look at because it will prevent when you ignore those parts of yourself, you end up unconsciously hurting people, because if you hate parts of yourself, you unconsciously express hatred toward other people. And I think that happens a lot in the church. If you believe that like you are bad and evil at your core, you're going to treat everybody like that on some level. It might be subtle, it might just like you might seem nice, but I do feel like it's a subtle cruelties that we could help prevent. So because of my mortality and feeling this urgency, I made all these videos just trying to put out anything that I knew that I felt like could help. So I kind of feel that moving forward, I would like to just be a person where I just want to educate people about what things mean so that it helps them in their journey of deciphering everything that's happening, and then maybe be a support. I mainly just want to help people, and I'm open to however that manifests.
Hmm.
Yeah.
What you were last
And
just
also being, oh, sorry,
second.
also being, I'm having more integrity. So talking about this is probably the hardest thing ever that I've ever really done, especially publicly, being more brave about what I really think, because I have lived my life not telling people what I think, and it was to the detriment of myself and many of my relationships. So I would just like to be more open and honest and
Hmm.
make it be okay to like, maybe you're not always making sense, and that's like okay. It doesn't
Hmm.
have to make sense. Like life doesn't have to make sense to you yet.
I
Yeah.
love that. And that's so right at the alley of what we all go through when we deconstruct and deconvert, is that we're realizing we're losing a false identity and reclaiming or discovering our real identity. And as a corollary, discovering we didn't have a voice. And I say this jokingly, but it's almost like you want to get that group of boys that were telling you this theology discussion is for the boys, not the girls, and be like, now Janine's now the one in the club. Now you
Oh
all need to come
no.
over and listen to her a little bit. Let her do a little talk about what the reality is what's really going on in life. But that I also wanted to just say the thing you said about subtle cruelties. I don't I think you said it that way, but that was one of the most profound things I think I've heard in months. Just the idea that when we are expressing hatred to other people, it's indicative in some cases where it's because we have hatred toward ourselves, and just how we speak to ourselves affects how we view the world and speak to other people. I feel like we could do an episode on that alone. So maybe it's my invitation to you is put some notes down. We'll do it. Um,
Yes.
but
Okay.
that's great. I mean, it's so true. And I think a lot of this stuff, when you realize that Christianity is mythology, but you also realize that this stuff is indicative of the journey that we're taking, that we all do want to kind of figure out how to die to ourselves and rise again to become the better person that we should be. That is kind of the human journey in a sense. And that when you realize that these messages in the Bible are woven into us, as and when we get so enraptured with the messaging that it becomes a part of us. And there's some good senses of like, yes, become the best person you can be. And there's part of you that kind of needs to die. Like if you're a really nasty person, put that to death and
Yeah.
try to show some kindness to people that need it. Um, but when you realize that this stuff does go to your psyche, even those good messages, even though there's some goodness there, um, there's also some very nasty messages, including things like your righteousness is like a filthy rag, and
Yeah.
um, all your goodness is worthless to God. Messages woven in so prevalently in our theology, the worm theology concept. You're nothing, and if you reject Christ, then ultimately your worth truly is still nothing, and you are condemned. You stand already condemned without Christ. So if you reject him, you're just still condemned, and ultimately your life is forfeit forever, and you're as good as scum. You get those messages from the earliest days, and especially if you truly dive into the deep theology, um, ironically called the doctrines of grace. But you really dive into the doctrines of grace and you weave that into your worldview. There's some self-hatred going on there, and you're right. It's gonna come out. You hate yourself enough, it'll show in how you affect you, how you relate to other people. So I love it. I love the way you're bringing those insights out. It's good stuff.
Absolutely. The God of the Bible, people don't realize until you look at it with new eyes, he's no different than like Neptune. People were like, "Oh, Neptune was so terrible because he raped many people, and so did Zeus, and our God is nothing like these fictional." It's like, well, I mean, the character of God seems quite angry and quite prideful and called for horrible things to happen to people.
Yeah. Yeah, he's
Yeah,
definitely a
so
psychopathic character. It's weird to me that people can't see that. Did that ever strike you? Like, can you all not see how psychopathic this character is?
it's because they've embodied it, and so they can't see it. They like I said, you unconsciously embody some of the terrible things without knowing.
Hmm.
So you got to defend yourself, and you got to defend him. But
Yeah,
I know that we're running on like low on time, and I wanted to ask you this question because I'm
sure.
asking everyone, and I am a collector of information from lots of different people. I'm
Nice.
curious about what does the word sacred mean to you now?
Hmm. That's a good question. It doesn't really mean anything to me. I think it's a construct. I am both a materialist and a nihilist. I think there's nothing beyond physical stuff here. I don't believe in any kind of magic or extra meaning. I think we're as special as the frog, and as special as the insect, and as special as the extinct dinosaurs. Um, I don't think there's anything sacred. Having said that, though, I do think that it's the concept, the word sacred, and the concept of sacred is something that we can arbitrarily put into our equation that um, helps us to feel like there's meaning, even though there's actually not. I don't think life is meaningful. I think life is meaningless. And ultimately, say an asteroid, destroys the Earth, and it's say in 20,000 years, and it all burns up, and we didn't get to space, so we're not on Mars and still surviving. We just, it all burns up. I think ultimately at that point we'd look back and say, if we could somehow still be existing and reflect on what just happened, that all of history is just, it's irrelevant. The Earth just blew up from an asteroid. Um, if we could reflect on that from an outsider's perspective, we'd be like, nothing ever mattered. Every war, every victory, every loss, every death, every birth, it never mattered. It's all back to a big ball of fire. So I am a nihilist. I don't think it matters. Having said that, you can't live that way. Like, you can't practically live as if it doesn't matter, even though it does, even though to me it doesn't matter. You can't, if you say that to yourself too much, you'll be like, why do I get up in the morning? Why get out of bed if it doesn't matter? Why live another day if it doesn't matter? And I know people do struggle with that. People get depressed about the nihilism part of it. I'm personally not depressed about it, even though I am very much a nihilist. But I think we have to. Um, I'll give another plug for a book. Let me find it here.
Yeah. Yes, and I'm writing them down.
Sasha Sagan wrote a book called "For Creatures, Small Creatures Such as We," and I interviewed her a while ago. It was a short interview. She didn't have much time, but it was good to talk to her. But the daughter of Carl Sagan, the astrophysicist, and um, the book is subtitled "Rituals for Finding Meaning in Our Unlikely World," and she talks about the idea that life is not. We don't need to connect it to this religion. We don't need to connect it to a divine character to find meaning, but we can still find meaning in the seasons of each year, and even this, the sun, seeing the sun and the moon every day. But the seasons of life, birthdays, anniversaries, children being born, funerals, we can find meaning that gives us purpose. We can make a purpose. And for me, like for example, Christmas obviously does not mean anything to me religiously anymore. But does it warm my heart to see a Christmas tree with twinkly lights and candles and smelling cinnamon and hot chocolate with marshmallows? Seeing the kids' eyes light up at seeing Christmas presents? Of course it does. It has nothing to do with Christ, but I love it. And that to me is there's a sacredness of saying, um, what is most precious in life? And to me, that relates to a couple big things, and I'm sure I'll miss something here, but obviously, first and foremost, people, loving the people around you with as much as you can, even the people that are difficult, trying to, understand them better and say they're probably difficult because they had a difficult life too. Trying to put yourself in their shoes and love them anyway if you can, with appropriate boundaries, but especially for the people that are your closest circle, to love them. And I've got four little ones. I love them with all my heart. To me, being connected to nature, stating the obvious there, I'm sure everybody would say that, but you know, to me, getting out and seeing the sunrise and the sunset as much as you can, when you see a beautiful blue sky with clouds, puffy clouds, stop, you look, take some pictures or whatever, but just stop and take deep breaths and soak it up. Get in the mountains, get by a stream if you can. Um, and I think too, another big part of it is realizing that as much as we're unlikely to have ever existed, it's and we're one of whatever trillion billions or trillions of species. We're not special. There's been many 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 species before us, and there'll be probably many after us. We're just this blip on the radar of time, but this is the time that we landed on. This is where the chips fell. This is where we ended up being alive, and our molecules will be alive in someone else someday. But this is who we are for today, and there's immense beauty. Um, beauty. I mentioned seeing my kids being born. The beauty of seeing a baby. Even just watching my wife when she was giving birth to our last one. The guttural, earthly groans, the birth pangs of you hear that, I mean, really loudly for a long time, and it just you feel very connected to the planet, to the cycles of life. Seeing the baby coming out of its mother with its umbilical cord still attached and crying for the first time and being put on its mother's breast and falling asleep and then nursing for the first time, and seeing that baby when you first get to dress it, and it's just once it's gotten in its little milk coma from nursing, and it's just so cute. It breaks your heart almost. Like, I want to freeze these moments. And to me, if I could use the word sacred, in some ways I wouldn't, but if I did, I would say it'd be to say these moments that you just want to freeze. They're as sacred as it gets. They're obviously fleeting, as we all remind ourselves. Um, but then lastly, to say, you were that. We keep looking at it as like, this is sacred. Like, go to that and look at that. And but somebody at some point would have, if they'd done the same thing, they would have looked at you when you were a baby and said, this little baby Janine is sacred. This baby Tim is sacred. And to look back at yourself and say, my journey is special. It's not special in the big picture. Um, and someday I'll be dirt again, and it just won't matter. And in 3 or 4 generations, nobody will know my name, and I have to be okay with that. and I'm not
Mm.
going anywhere. So I don't get to, reclaim my name in eternity. It's just, I'm a blip on the radar, but you're, turning the focus back on you and saying, I have a mind. And as long as it's sound, I'm going to examine myself and say, I want to celebrate who I am. And a big part of that to me started with, and I'll try to wrap this up, started honestly with looking at Christian purity culture toward men, where they would
Mm.
send a lot of messages of stop the masturbation, stop thinking about girls, stop undressing them in your mind. And I realized that with all these negative messages, they never said, you realize your body makes like 50,000 sperm an hour.
Yeah.
And like, isn't that amazing? And like, there was no celebration. And to celebrate yourself, both in terms of just who you are, celebrate your eroticism. I've learned learning as a Christian to celebrate your eroticism, your desire for pleasure and even fantasy, and even beyond sexuality, to just appreciate who you are, to just take a deep breath and soak in you're alive. The likelihood of you living is so small, but you're alive for this brief moment, and then you're gone. So celebrate it while you can. And obviously, in a sense, this with this channel, the picture is the sacredness of leaving it better than you found it. Like if like people won't know my name in a few generations, but or even one, who knows? But you can leave it better than you found it in other ways. You can plant the seeds that grow into the trees that become shade for the next generation. And if I
Wow.
could leave something sacred, it'd be to say I want to plant some trees, philosophical trees, and to think I was 43 when I deconverted. And in some ways, my life wasn't horrible before then, but I feel like I wasted some years. To
I
think,
could
what
see.
if I could give the next generation or the generation after for sure a chance to by the time that they're, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old and truly beginning to be self-aware, to think that they're free of mythology and they can just enjoy life without worrying, is there a God watching? Am I displeasing him? He's seeing in my head and he's angry at me. Just to be completely free of that and just breathe your deep breaths, live your life, look at the world free of that, and start being free in your mind from the youngest of ages. And I'm obviously trying hard to do that with my children. But I would love to see it if I, you know, could live a couple generations longer and then look back and see what happened. I'd love to think that I and the other people in our community that are trying to plant these seeds, that we actually did make a difference. And the sacredness of leaving a heritage. We used to talk about a godly heritage, in the church, leave a legacy of godliness, of Christ likeness. I want to leave a legacy of people being free of mythology and free to just love who they are. Um,
Wow, that's
that's as
so
sacred as it
beautiful.
gets to me, but it's pretty special to me. I know it's not special in the truest sense. It's not profane or sacred. It's not holy, but to me, it becomes sacred. And that's what I'm going to spend my life doing. And I think I had a friend years ago that she loved the phrase "pursue the beauty,"
Mm.
and I think pursuing and embracing the beautiful parts of life, I don't think we do it enough. I think a lot of us, we're just so darn busy, and sometimes it's important to just step back and say, you know, um, you know, look at your children; they're so beautiful. Or look at, for me, if I was, look at your wife, look at her naked, not in the sense of like because I want to have sex with her. Just look at her body, look at her nakedness, and just soak up the humanity and the beauty of it. Um, and it's just so precious. And I feel like at times my heart is overwhelmed both with how much I want to pursue those things that I'm talking about, but also overwhelmed with the fact that life is short and where there's never going to be enough time. So many books, so little time, as they say. But
Yes.
we're there's when you see like I'll leave it this way. This will be my last comment on this. I will say to my kids sometimes, because they're aware of Christianity, they're very much exposed to Christian teaching. I'll say, it's not real, right? And they'll look at me and they'll say, Daddy, you don't even have to say it. I know it's not real.
Oh my
That's
gosh.
that's sacred to me. That'll blow
Wow.
that'll blow my heart into a million pieces of pain and joy. My kids looking at me and saying, "You don't even have to say it, Daddy. We know this isn't real."
I
I
agree with that. Be yourself with my dad. Like just be yourself and then you just like see it, you know?
Yeah, exactly. But thank you for asking. If you've got a minute, what would you say is what is sacred mean to you?
So I actually have to go very soon.
Okay.
I hear them screaming outside, so I hope you guys don't hear it.
Yep.
But I
30-second answer.
they're playing outside. But for me, life is miraculous. I think many things are sacred, but I do think it's what we give meaning to.
Mm.
And so for me, it's those kind of like what you said, those pauses and those moments that you want to freeze forever. Or even it could be intentional. It could be a moment that you like the holidays, but I like creating my own versions of those things. So for me right now in the spring, it would be appreciating that there is a spring after the winter with all that seasonal, depressive feelings and everything's so dark. It's sacred the day that you see that crisp spring morning and then hearing the new baby birds and everything. So things like that in nature are sacred to me, and of course childbirth, things like this.
Yeah. Just seeing life shouting and singing and tweeting and whatever. It's easy to get a lot of joy from that. Well, I know you said you get kids at the door, so I should let you go, but I will have links beneath our video again for everyone to go check out. Janine, well, I really do want to have you back at some point to talk about some of the more topical things. But everyone, please go like and subscribe. Keep an eye on what she's doing and the great messages she's sending. And Janine, thank you so much for chatting today. It's been great to hear your story and get to know you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to give my story. I like that you give the space for people to share their different perspectives from it, because we don't often get that when we're leaving. So I think what you're doing is really important.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, thank you for sharing your story. Awesome to get to know you, and let's definitely do it again.
Yes, I would love that. Thanks, you Janine. So much.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.